On the evening of October 23, 2010, a woman named Donna Gross stepped away from her unit at Napa State Hospital for a dinner break. It was an ordinary moment at the end of an ordinary shift, the kind of pause that happens dozens of times a day on a working hospital campus. The path she walked crossed 138 acres of grounds in the northern reaches of California's wine country, where the air in late October carries the last warmth of harvest season and the hills above the Napa Valley are just beginning to turn. She was 54 years old and she had worked at this hospital for 14 years. She did not return. When her colleagues grew concerned and went looking, they found her in a courtyard on the grounds. The man responsible was a patient with a long and recorded history of violent crime, a history the institution had possessed, reviewed, and filed. He had been walking those same grounds, unsupervised, for reasons that no satisfactory answer has ever fully explained. What happened to Donna Gross was not a random tragedy. It was not an unforeseeable accident. It was the endpoint of more than a century of overcrowding, neglect, broken promises, and a system that had lost track of what it had been built to do. Napa State Hospital was born as one of the most beautiful and ambitious acts of mercy in California's history. What it became is something else entirely. But to understand how a place built for healing became a place where people feared for their lives, we have to go back to where it all began. Chapter 1. The Dream on the Napa River. To understand what Napa State Hospital was supposed to be, you have to understand the world that built it. In the decades following the Civil War, something remarkable was happening across America. A genuine, widespread, and largely well-intentioned revolution in how society thought about the human mind. For most of recorded history, mental illness had been treated as a moral failure, a divine punishment, or simply a condition to be hidden away from polite society. The asylum, in its earliest American form, was less a place of healing than a place of removal, a locked room at the edge of town where the inconvenient were deposited and forgotten. But by the 1860s and 1870s, a new philosophy had taken hold, and at the center of it stood a Pennsylvania physician named Thomas Story Kirkbride. Kirkbride never visited California. He never walked the land that would become Napa State Hospital, and never breathed the particular air of that valley. He didn't need to. His ideas had already traveled ahead of him, carried westward by legislators and superintendents who had read his work and believed that he was right. Kirkbride's argument was elegant in its simplicity and radical in its implications. The environment was the medicine. Architecture was not merely a container for treatment. It was treatment itself, a building that was beautiful, that offered light and air and prospect, that situated its residents in a landscape of order and calm. Such a building could do what no drug and no restraint could accomplish. It could reach the disordered mind through the senses, through the rhythm of daily labor, through the simple fact of being treated as someone worthy of a beautiful place to live. His design specifications became known as the Kirkbride Plan. Dozens of institutions across America were built to his model. Each one was intended to be, in his words, a special apparatus for the care of lunacy, and California needed one badly. The state's first asylum, established in Stockton in the early 1850s, had been overwhelmed almost from the day it opened. The gold rush had done what gold rushes always do. It had flooded the state with people chasing a promise, many of whom found something very different from what they had imagined. The displaced, the destitute, the men broken by the mines and the failed claims and the long journey west, the immigrants who arrived speaking no English into a society that had no framework to receive them. They accumulated at the edges of California's new cities, and eventually they accumulated at Stockton until Stockton could hold no more. By 1872, the state of California was looking for land. What they found was a parcel of extraordinary beauty. The land had belonged to Cayetano Juarez, a Californio who held it as part of the old Rancho Toluca, a Mexican land grant that stretched from the Napa River eastward toward hills that would one day look down on vineyards known across the world. The state bought it that year and immediately began making plans. The choice of location was not incidental. The founders of what would become Napa State Hospital looked at this land, its air, its openness, its distance from the pressures of San Francisco, and believed it was part of the answer. The setting itself would begin the healing before the patients even stepped through the doors. On November 15, 1875, the Napa Insane Asylum officially opened. The centerpiece of the new campus was a building that everyone who saw it simply called the Castle. 4 stories of ornate Gothic brickwork, imposing and almost romantic in its ambition. It rose from the valley floor like something transplanted from another century and another continent. It was designed to house 500 patients and to feel nothing like a prison. The intention encoded in every arched window and every dressed stone detail was that the people inside were not inmates. They were patients, and they deserved a place that said so. Beyond the castle, the campus spread across nearly 200 acres. There were dairy operations and poultry ranches, vegetable gardens, and fruit orchards that produced a substantial portion of everything the residents ate. Patients worked this land as therapy. The Kirkbride philosophy held that purposeful labor, work connected to seasons and growth and visible result, was one of the most powerful tools available for restoring a mind that had come unmoored. In its first years, Napa genuinely attempted to be what it promised. The ratio of staff to patients was manageable. The grounds were maintained. The therapeutic intention, however imperfectly realized, was present in the institution's daily operations. It was a real vision. The people who built this place believed in it. But the vision rested on a set of assumptions that California was already, quietly, beginning to abandon. That the numbers would remain manageable, that the funding would follow the need, that a society willing to build something this beautiful would remain willing to sustain it. Those assumptions were fragile from the beginning, and in the years to come, every one of them would be broken. Chapter 2. The population explodes. There was a flaw built into the Kirkbride model from the beginning, not in its intentions and not in its architecture, but in the assumptions it required to function. Thomas Story Kirkbride had designed a system that depended on 3 things being present simultaneously: adequate space, sufficient staffing, and sustained funding. Remove any one of those 3, and the entire philosophy collapsed. The beautiful building, the grounds, and the vegetable gardens remained. But the thing that made them medicine, rather than mere scenery, disappeared the moment the institution became too large and too crowded to treat its residents as individuals. California removed all 3. It just did it slowly enough that no single moment announced the failure. By the early 1890s, the institution held over 1,300 patients. It had been designed for 500. The castle, that ornate Gothic monument to the belief that the mentally ill deserved beauty and dignity, was now a building in which 2.5 times its intended population attempted to live, sleep, eat, and receive care. The grounds that were supposed to offer space and air and therapeutic calm were instead crowded with people the state had nowhere else to put. To understand how this happened so quickly, you have to understand who was being committed to institutions like Napa in the late 19th century. And the answer is both broader and more troubling than the word insane might suggest. The legal and medical definitions of mental illness in this era were elastic to the point of meaninglessness. Alcoholism was sufficient grounds for commitment. So was poverty, particularly among immigrants. The railroad expansions of the 1870s and 1880s accelerated everything. New rail lines opened California's interior and brought tens of thousands of new arrivals: laborers, speculators, families chasing agricultural promises, and immigrants arriving into a state that was growing faster than its social infrastructure could accommodate. When people fell through the crack, the asylum was the net that caught them. Napa caught more than its share. In 1893, the state opened Mendocino State Hospital to the north, specifically designed to siphon off some of the pressure that had built to dangerous levels at Napa. And for a time, it worked. The numbers eased, the breathing room returned, and administrators in Sacramento could tell themselves that the system was self-correcting, that building a new institution had solved the problem rather than merely deferred it. It had deferred it. Within a decade, Napa's population was climbing again. What was dying during these years was the philosophy that had justified building the place in the first instance. The Kirkbride ideal of individualized attention and therapeutic engagement required something that overcrowded institutions by definition cannot provide: time. Time for a physician to know a patient, to understand the specific contours of their suffering, to design a course of treatment calibrated to who they were rather than which bed they occupied. When a single doctor is responsible for hundreds of patients, that time does not exist. The relationship between physician and patient, which Kirkbride had placed at the center of his entire model, becomes a fiction maintained on paper and abandoned in practice. The farm continued operating, and patients continued to work them. But the meaning of that labor had quietly shifted. What had been conceived as a therapeutic engagement with the rhythms of growth and seasons had become, as the institution's financial pressures mounted, something closer to an economic necessity. The patients working Napa's fields were keeping the institution fed because the state was not adequately funding it any other way. The therapy had become labor. The patients had become workers. Reports documenting the overcrowding were written and filed. They made their way to Sacramento, where they were received, reviewed, and largely set aside. The state was aware of what was happening at Napa. Awareness, in this case, as in so many that would follow, produced no proportionate response. This is the moment where Napa State Hospital stops being one thing and becomes another. It enters this period as a hospital that happens to be larger than intended. It exits it as something fundamentally different, a warehouse for human beings that happens to employ doctors. That threshold, once crossed, would never be recrossed. Everything that followed, the experiments, the scandals, the violence, the death of a woman in a courtyard on an October evening more than a century later, grows from this root. The institution lost its purpose long before it lost its reputation, and nobody in a position to restore it ever chose to. Chapter 3: Cures That Weren't. By the time the 20th century arrived, American psychiatry had grown impatient with its own limitations. The belief that kindness, structure, and a beautiful environment could restore a disordered mind had failed to deliver the wholesale cures its founders had promised. Institutions like Napa were overcrowded, underfunded, and producing no dramatic evidence that their patients were getting better in any meaningful numbers. Something new was needed, something decisive, something that looked finally like science. Though what followed was not science. It wore science's clothing and spoke science's language, but underneath it was something older and less defensible. The institutional impulse to control what it could not cure, dressed in the vocabulary of medicine to make the controlling seem like caring. The first and most sweeping expression of this new era at Napa was eugenics. California had embraced the eugenics movement earlier and more aggressively than almost any other state in the nation. The theory that human heredity could and should be managed by the state, that certain categories of people ought not to reproduce, that sterilization was not a punishment but a public health measure, found enthusiastic support in Sacramento and in the administrations of state institutions across California. By the 1910s and 20s, Napa State Hospital had an active sterilization program. Patients were sterilized as a matter of institutional policy. California was responsible for roughly a third of all forced sterilizations carried out under state law in the United States, the most aggressive eugenic state in the country, so aggressive that its program would later be studied by officials in Nazi Germany, who looked to California's model as a template for their own. The patients at Napa were among those who bore the consequences of that policy in the most permanent way imaginable. The sterilization program was only the beginning of what the new century's confidence in intervention would produce. Insulin coma therapy arrived in American psychiatric practice in the 1930s, imported from Europe with considerable enthusiasm. The treatment involved administering large doses of insulin to patients, driving their blood sugar so low that they lost consciousness. The theory held that the physiological shock of this near-death state and the gradual return from it could somehow reorganize a mind that conventional treatment had failed to reach. There was no reliable scientific evidence that it worked. There was considerable evidence that it carried serious risks, dangerous complications, lasting neurological damage, and in some cases, death. It was administered at institutions across California throughout the 1930s and 1940s, including at Napa to patients who had not meaningfully consented and had no meaningful power to refuse. Electroconvulsive therapy followed to keep large populations of distressed and sometimes dangerous people functioning within walls that were not equipped to adequately treat them. It became something it was never supposed to be. It was applied to patients who were disruptive, to patients who were inconvenient, to patients who had been misdiagnosed and were not mentally ill in any sense that the treatment was designed to address. And then there were the lobotomies. Prefrontal lobotomy became one of the most widespread and catastrophic medical enthusiasms of the mid-20th century. At state psychiatric hospitals across California in the 1940s and 1950s, lobotomies were performed on patients who had little practical ability to refuse them, whose families were rarely given full information about what the procedure involved, and whose outcomes ranged from profound personality destruction to death. Napa, as one of California's flagship psychiatric facilities, operated fully within this system. Amid all of this, the institution produced a case that illustrated, with terrible clarity, what happened when a dangerous person was processed through a system designed for something else entirely. Earl Nelson was a serial killer, known in the press of his era as the Gorilla Killer, who was admitted to Napa State Hospital multiple times in the early decades of the 20th century. He was assessed, he was housed, and he escaped, more than once. Each time the institution released him back into the world, he went on to kill. By the time he was finally captured in Canada in 1927 and executed the following year, he had murdered at least 20 people. Napa had held him in its hands and let him go. The institution was not built to contain someone like Earl Nelson, but it had accepted him anyway, and the people who died at his hands paid for that institutional mismatch with their lives. By the years following the Second World War, even the physical symbol of Napa's founding idealism was gone. The castle was torn down. The decision was made, the wrecking crews came, and the building that had defined the institution's identity for 70 years was demolished and replaced with structures that made no such argument. The new buildings were functional, economical, and entirely without the conviction that had produced the original. They were built for warehousing. They were not built for healing. In those same decades, two figures passed through Napa, whose presence there speaks to the breadth of what the institution had become. Clarice Vance had been one of the most celebrated vaudeville performers in America, a woman who had filled theaters from coast to coast, who had made audiences laugh and weep and rise to their feet. She ended her days at Napa, admitted in declining health, dying inside an institution she had likely never imagined she would inhabit. And Carlton Watkins, the photographer whose images of Yosemite in the 1860s gave Americans their first true vision of that landscape, and whose work is credited with helping move Congress and President Lincoln toward the 1864 legislation protecting Yosemite for public use, was admitted to Napa by his own daughter in his final years. He died there. The man who had shown America one of its most beautiful places died forgotten in one of its least examined ones. This is what Napa State Hospital had become by the middle of the 20th century, a place where the tools meant to heal were being used to manage, where the patients inside had progressively less say over what was done to their bodies and their minds, and where the distance between the institution's founding vision and its daily reality had grown so vast that the founding vision itself had been literally demolished and hauled away. The castle was gone. What replaced it had no philosophy worth the name, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 4: The Forgotten, the Famous, and the Dangerous. An institution reveals its true nature not in its mission statements or its architectural ambitions, but in the people it actually holds. Look at who California sent to Napa State Hospital across its first century, and what you find is not a hospital in any straightforward sense. What you find is a repository, a place where California deposited everyone it didn't know what else to do with. The cases accumulate, and each one illuminates something the official record would prefer to leave in shadow. Consider Sarah Catherine Arledge. She was an artist and experimental filmmaker, genuinely gifted, working in a medium that few women of her era were permitted to occupy seriously. In 1956, she was committed to Napa State Hospital by her husband Clyde Smith, forcibly by his initiative, with no independent clinical basis that the record has established. There was a husband who wanted her removed from her life, a legal system that gave him the tools to accomplish that, and an institution that accepted her without asking questions that might have complicated the paperwork. She was a woman whose husband found her inconvenient in an era when that distinction was not one the law was particularly interested in drawing. Her case was not unusual, it was representative. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the commitment of women to institutions like Napa on the testimony of husbands or male relatives, without independent clinical verification, was not an aberration of the system. It was a feature of it. Napa absorbed these cases the way it absorbed everything, without adequate review, and without any reliable mechanism for those committed to demonstrate that they didn't belong there. Then there was Henry Peavey, cook and valet to William Desmond Taylor, the silent film director whose unsolved murder in February of 1922 became one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. Peavey was a peripheral figure in a famous case, a man whose proximity to scandal made him interesting to the press and inconvenient to everyone else. He was admitted to Napa after being diagnosed with syphilis in the aftermath of Taylor's death. The case around him still officially open. The questions about what he knew or didn't know never fully resolved. He ended up at Napa while the mystery he had briefly orbited moved on without him. By the middle of the 20th century, the pattern was unmistakable. Napa had become California's answer to every question the state could not otherwise resolve. A final destination for the criminal and the forgotten, the inconvenient and the genuinely suffering, all of them housed together with inadequate differentiation and insufficient care. The institution did not distinguish carefully between a woman committed by a manipulative husband and a man with a genuine and dangerous psychiatric condition. It received them both and found them abed. And then the 1970s arrived, and everything shifted again. The deinstitutionalization movement had been draining California's state hospitals for a decade by the time the mid-70s came, emptying beds, releasing patients into communities that had been promised robust mental health support networks, and received, in most cases, almost nothing of the kind. Napa's population contracted. The wards that had been overcrowded began to feel, relatively speaking, less so. It looked briefly and deceptively like progress. Into this changed landscape walked Richard Allen Davis. In 1976, Davis, who would later become notorious as the murderer of 12-year-old Polly Klaas in 1993, was a young man with an already extensive criminal history. He faked a suicide attempt with a specific purpose: to be transferred from a correctional setting to Napa State Hospital, which he had correctly assessed as a more permeable environment. He was transferred, and then he escaped. The hospital was not a healing institution to Richard Allen Davis. It was an obstacle with gaps in it, and he found one. The administrative system that processed his transfer, the clinical system that assessed his risk, the security system that was supposed to contain him, all of it failed in sequence, efficiently and completely. Davis walked out, and the institution returned to its paperwork. It was a preview of the dynamic that would define Napa in the decades ahead. Dangerous people being routed into a facility not built to hold them, finding the gaps that the institution's design and its chronic underfunding had left open and walking through. And yet, in the very same years, something else was also happening inside Napa's walls. Something that no policy had produced and no administrator had planned. In 1978, a proto-punk band called The Cramps played a free concert for the patients of Napa State Hospital. The performance was filmed, and the footage that survives is genuinely extraordinary. Not for its musical content, though the band played with the feral energy that defined them, but for what it captures in the faces and bodies of the people in that room. Patients who spent their days navigating the diminishments of institutional life were, for one afternoon, in the presence of something loud and alive and entirely indifferent to their diagnoses. They danced, they crowded the stage, they existed, fully and visibly, as people responding to music rather than as cases to be administered. It is one of the strangest moments in the hospital's recorded history. It is also one of the most human, and it matters precisely because it was unplanned. Because it demonstrated that the residents of Napa, however the institution had processed and categorized and managed them, had not been reduced to what the institution believed them to be. But that moment of humanity existed inside a structure that was about to change in ways that would make everything that had come before seem, by comparison, almost manageable. By the end of the 1970s, Napa State Hospital was standing at the edge of its most consequential transformation. Not a reform, not a rebuilding. A fundamental change in the nature of the population it was asked to hold, one driven not by medicine, not by science, not by any philosophy of healing, but by the courts. and the institution, already compromised in every structural way that mattered, was entirely unprepared for what was coming. Chapter 5: The Courts Take Over. In 1967, California passed the Lanterman-Petrus-Short Act, a landmark legislation that fundamentally restructured the rules governing who could be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric institution and for how long. The law was a genuine reform, born of genuine concern. The old commitment system had allowed exactly the kind of abuses that Napa's history had already demonstrated. Husbands committing wives, families disposing of inconvenient relatives, courts sending people to institutions for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. The new law raised the legal threshold for involuntary commitment, strengthened patient rights, and made indefinite institutionalization dramatically harder to sustain. The theory was that the people leaving the state hospitals would be caught by a network of community mental health centers, locally based, accessible, humane alternatives to the large institutional model that had so thoroughly failed. California would close the warehouse and open the neighborhood clinic. The mentally ill would be treated closer to home with more individualized care. The community mental health network was never adequately funded, and it never materialized at the scale the legislation assumed. The people discharged from institutions like Napa moved to the streets, to the shelters, to the jails, and the jails increasingly moved them back. Through the 1980s, federal mental health funding cuts compounded the collapse. The Reagan administration's restructuring of federal mental health support withdrew resources from a community infrastructure that had never been robust enough to survive withdrawal. Reagan having presided over the restructuring of California's state hospital system as governor before pursuing similar policies at the national level. The result was visible to anyone who looked. The chronically mentally ill living on sidewalks, cycling through emergency rooms and county jails, receiving crisis intervention instead of treatment, stabilized and released and destabilized again in an endless loop that served no one. And then the courts found an answer to their own version of this problem. Criminal defendants found not guilty by reason of insanity or assessed as incompetent to stand trial needed somewhere to go. Prisons were not equipped to provide psychiatric treatment. The community mental health system was overwhelmed. The state hospitals had beds, emptied by deinstitutionalization, but beds nonetheless. And so, the courts began sending their most difficult cases to facilities like Napa. People whose crimes ranged from assault to armed robbery to rape to murder, housed in a psychiatric hospital that had been designed for a population of civil commitments and had never been structurally or operationally rethought to accommodate anything else. The transformation was not announced. It accumulated. In 1995, approximately 20% of Napa's patients had arrived via the criminal justice system. By 2010, that figure was 92%. In the space of 15 years, Napa State Hospital had been functionally converted from a psychiatric facility into something the justice system needed, but could not officially name. It was, in operational reality, a medium-security detention facility for people with serious mental illness. It was still called a hospital. Its staff were still trained as clinicians. Its protocols were still written for patients rather than inmates. And the people walking its 138-acre campus now included individuals convicted of murder, rape, child molestation, and armed robbery. On the ground, the staff understood what was happening before any official report put it in writing. In 2001, the San Francisco Chronicle published an investigation into conditions at Napa State Hospital. The reporting described an institution in which workers were overwhelmed, undertrained for the population they were now managing, and increasingly frightened. Staff told reporters that the influx of violent criminal defendants had changed the character of the institution in ways its safety infrastructure was entirely unprepared to handle. The investigation was published. It was read, but it changed nothing. Inside the hospital, clinical staff were doing what people in dysfunctional institutions always do when management will not act. They tried to solve the problem themselves. By 2005, a group of Napa clinicians had developed a detailed, workable proposal for a dedicated high-security unit, a separate housing environment for the hospital's most dangerous patients, with enhanced staffing, enhanced monitoring, and protocols designed for people with violent histories. The proposal was submitted to management. In 2006, it was abandoned without implementation. No high-security unit was built. The dangerous patients continued to walk the same grounds as everyone else. In 2004, the United States Department of Justice conducted a formal investigation of Napa State Hospital. Its findings were not ambiguous. The report cited widespread and systemic deficiencies throughout the institution, and the specifics were damning in their detail. Patients were dying by suicide in ways that proper monitoring would have prevented. Patients were being assaulted by other patients with a regularity that the institution had failed to address. Staff abuse was on the record. And during the period under review, 2 patients had been murdered by other patients inside the hospital. The report found that California was failing its constitutional obligation to protect the people it was holding involuntarily, and the evidence it assembled to support that conclusion was specific, sourced, and irrefutable. California's response was to sign a consent decree with the Department of Justice, a formal agreement requiring compliance reviews twice a year conducted by federal monitors to assess whether the state was meeting its obligations. The reviews began. They continued. The conditions that had produced the Department of Justice's findings did not change at any pace commensurate with the urgency of what had been established. Meanwhile, the financial arithmetic of inaction was becoming impossible to ignore. Worker injuries at California's state psychiatric hospitals were estimated to cost the state nearly $100 million annually, in medical treatment, in legal settlements, in lost productivity, in the cascading expenses of a workforce being physically damaged by the conditions it worked in. The high-security unit that clinical staff had proposed in 2005 and management had abandoned in 2006 would have cost a fraction of that. The proposal that went nowhere would have been paid for many times over by a single year of the injury costs its implementation would have reduced. The math was not complicated. The math was never the obstacle. The obstacle was an administration that had absorbed the warnings, filed the reports, signed the consent decree, and continued operating as though the urgency encoded in all of those documents belonged to someone else's problem. By the late 2000s, Napa State Hospital had arrived at the precise intersection of every failure its history had produced. It was a minimum to medium security psychiatric facility, housing a population that any honest assessment would have classified as requiring maximum security containment. It was staffed at ratios designed for an era and a patient population that no longer existed. Its safety protocols had been written for residents who were not the majority of its current population. Its management had received warnings from its own clinical staff, from investigative journalists, from the United States Department of Justice, and from the injury reports of the people who came to work there every day. Every warning had been delivered. Every warning had been recorded. Every warning had been ignored. The institution had been told by its own staff, by journalists, and by the United States Department of Justice that it could not adequately protect the people inside it. All that remained was for the cost of that failure to be paid by a specific person on a specific evening in a way that could not be absorbed into a quarterly report. Chapter 6: Inside the Daily Horror. There is a point at which statistics stop functioning as information and begin functioning as a kind of shield. The violence in numbers at Napa State Hospital in the late 2000s had crossed that threshold. On an average day at Napa State Hospital, in the years leading up to 2010, 3 members of the staff were assaulted, not in a week nor across a month. On an average day, 7 patients were assaulted on that same average day by other patients, in the wards and the corridors, and on the grounds of a facility whose stated purpose was their protection and care. In the second quarter of 2010 alone, nearly 200 attacks on hospital staff were recorded. That was 4 times the rate of the same quarter the previous year. In the same period, 692 patient assaults were recorded, 7 times the number from the second quarter of 2009. The violence was accelerating. Whatever was driving it was not being addressed, and the absence of an adequate response was not a neutral condition. It was a cause. In 2009, 1,580 crimes were reported at Napa State Hospital. More than 1,200 of them were batteries. The vast majority of those crimes were never prosecuted. They were absorbed into the institution's internal accounting, noted in reports that went to management and to Sacramento, and produced, in most cases, no criminal consequence for the people who committed them and no structural change in the conditions that enabled them. Step away from the numbers for a moment and into the physical reality of what it meant to work at Napa in these years. 6 medical staff members were responsible for 46 patients. The panic buttons that staff carried on their belts, the primary personal safety tool available to clinical workers on the grounds, functioned only inside the main building. Step outside, onto the pathways that cross the 138 acres of campus, and the button went silent. The signal died. Whatever was happening to you on that path was happening outside the range of the system designed to summon help. The hospital police, whose presence was the institution's answer to the question of physical security, were headquartered at a distance from the medical units that made timely response to a distress call a matter of chance rather than design. The workers who lived inside this reality spoke about it, when they spoke at all, only without their names attached. The fear of retaliation kept most of them silent in any official capacity. But to journalists anonymously, they described what their days actually felt like. One registered nurse put it this way: "You are constantly living in fear for your life. You have to have eyes in the back of your head and always be looking for an exit. Not an exit from the job, an exit from the room, from the corridor, from whatever space you currently occupied, because knowing where the door was at all times had become a survival skill in a place where the help that was supposed to respond might be too far away to arrive in time." These were not rumors. They were first-hand accounts of events that had occurred inside the facility, had been processed medically and administratively, and had changed nothing about the conditions that produced them. Since 2005, more than 250 hospital workers per year had missed at least one day of work due to injuries sustained at Napa. Every year, the number held. Every year, the institution continued operating on the same staffing ratios, the same safety protocols, the same administrative posture of awareness without action. The financial cost of that posture was, by any reasonable estimate, approaching $100 million annually. Worker medical costs, legal settlements, disability claims, the compounding expenses of a workforce being steadily damaged by its working conditions. Set that figure beside the high security unit that clinical staff had designed and proposed in 2005, the unit that management had reviewed and set aside in 2006. The unit would have cost a fraction of a single year's injury expenses. The state was spending more money on the consequences of its inaction than it would have spent on the solution. The administration knew this. The figures were in the same files as the assault reports and the Department of Justice findings and the consent decree compliance reviews. The arithmetic was never the reason nothing changed, and through all of it, there was another population that history has tended to overlook: the civilly committed, people who had come to Napa through the mental health system rather than the criminal justice system, whose illness had brought them there rather than their violence. They were housed in the same facility, exposed to the same dangers as the staff who were supposed to be caring for them. They had no panic buttons, they had no union, they were voiceless, and they were being failed as completely as everyone else. Among the forensic patients walking Napa's grounds in the autumn of 2010 was a man named Jess Willard Massey. He had been in the California State Hospital system since 1993. He had arrived following charges in Sacramento County that included robbery, assault, and attempted murder. He had been declared legally insane by the courts, a determination that routed him into the psychiatric system rather than the prison system, into an institution whose mission was treatment rather than containment. By October of 2010, he was 37 years old, and he was walking the grounds of Napa State Hospital without supervision. His history of violence was on file. The risk he represented had been identified. It had not been mitigated, not by the staffing levels, not by the monitoring protocols, not by any of the safety measures that the institution had described in its public communications as adequate. Everything this section has described, all of it is not background. It is causation. It is the specific, established, preventable accumulation of institutional failures that converges with the precision of a closed argument on a single evening in October 2010. Then one day, a woman named Donna Gross stepped away from her unit for a dinner break. Chapter 7. October 23, 2010. We have been here before, at this evening, on these grounds. in this particular autumn light. But we are here now with everything we did not have at the beginning. We know what the institution was built to be and what it became. We know about the reports that were filed and the proposals that were abandoned. We know about the millions of dollars spent annually on the consequences of inaction and the high security unit that would have cost less and was never built. We are ready now to understand what happened. Donna Gross was 54 years old. She had been a psychiatric technician at Napa State Hospital for 14 years. Not a brief posting, not a way station to something else, but a career. She was not a symbol. She was not a cautionary tale assembled after the fact to illustrate a policy failure. She was a person. And she went to work one day, the way she had gone to work on thousands of other days, and she stepped away from her unit for a dinner break in the early evening, and she walked out onto the grounds. The path she took was a well-traveled route, used regularly by staff and patients alike, the kind of path that, in a properly secured facility, would have been safe precisely because of how many people used it. At Napa, in the autumn of 2010, it was not safe. It was simply familiar. Jess Willard Massey encountered her on that path. He wanted money. What followed is not something that requires elaboration to be understood. Donna Gross did not return to her unit. Her colleagues grew concerned, the particular specific concern of people who work in a dangerous place and know when someone is late, that late can mean something worse than late. They went looking. They found her at 6:10 in the evening in a courtyard on the grounds of the hospital where she had worked for 14 years. She had been strangled. Massey was arrested. He would eventually be convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for her murder. The criminal case resolved with the clarity that institutional accountability never would. The hospital's response came quickly, in the form of a written statement from a spokesperson affirming that the safety of employees and patients was the hospital's top priority. It was language that had appeared in nearly identical form after previous incidents, issued and filed and set aside while the conditions it claimed to address went unaddressed. It arrived now in the aftermath of a woman's death with the full weight of its own history behind it. It meant what it had always meant, which was nothing actionable. But something was different this time. The silence that fear of retaliation had imposed on people who had known for years what the institution was began to dissolve. Colleagues who had spoken to journalists only without their names now spoke more openly to the press and to union representatives and to state legislators who had not previously been paying sufficient attention. The specific personal nature of what had happened, not a statistic, not a reported assault, not an incident number in a quarterly summary, but a named woman who had worked there for 14 years and who was dead, created a space for public acknowledgement that the prior years of silence had never opened. The California Division of Occupational Safety and Health, Cal-OSHA, conducted an investigation. In April of 2011, it issued a fine of $100,140 against the Department of Mental Health. The language of the Cal-OSHA report was direct in a way that official documents rarely permit themselves to be. It concluded that the safety violations at Napa State Hospital had caused the death of Donna Gross, not contributed to, not created conditions that may have been a factor in. It was the cause. The Department of Mental Health announced its intention to appeal the fine. On December 11, 2010, less than 7 weeks after Donna Gross was found in that courtyard, a rehab therapist at Napa State Hospital was attacked by a patient who had assaulted another worker just days before. The therapist suffered 4 skull fractures. The institution had not changed. The danger had not receded. The death of one employee had not produced the structural reforms that years of warnings had failed to produce. The machine continued operating, and the machine continued harming the people inside it. In the months that followed, workers at Napa organized in a way they had not organized before. They formed the Safety Now Coalition, hospital employees who had decided that the internal channels had been exhausted and that public pressure was what remained. They held protests at the hospital gates in January and March of 2011, demanding the reforms that management had refused to implement. The protests were covered, the demands were recorded. Some changes eventually came, but slowly, and after a fight that no one who had watched this institution across its full history would have found surprising. The question that the full arc of Napa State Hospital makes unavoidable is not whether Donna Gross deserved better. She did. The patients who were assaulted deserved better. The staff who came to work afraid deserved better. The question is how an institution built on the foundational belief that care is possible arrives at a place where the people it asks to provide that care cannot safely walk across its own grounds. The answer, assembled from the evidence, is not complicated. It is only long. Chapter 8. Reckoning and Reform. In the weeks and months following Donna Gross's death, California moved, haltingly, partially, under the specific pressure of public outrage and union demands, and a Cal OSHA report that had used the word caused in a way that made deniability difficult. The movement was real. It was also, measured against the scale and duration of what had produced the crisis, achingly insufficient. The first concrete response came in April of 2011, when the statewide hiring ban that had applied to Department of Mental Health facilities was lifted. The ban had been restricting the ability of institutions like Napa to hire new staff even as their violence statistics climbed, and their existing workforce was being injured at rates that should have constituted an emergency in their own right. Its removal deserved recognition as the minimum rather than the achievement. The more significant legislative response took longer to arrive. On September 28, 2014, Governor Jerry Brown signed 4 pieces of legislation that collectively represented the most substantial structural response to the crisis at California's state hospitals that Sacramento had yet produced. The legislation was genuine. The people who fought for it had earned it through sustained pressure, applied over years of resistance. None of it should be minimized. On the ground, the changes produced genuine if uneven improvement. New staffing structures took shape. Risk classification became more systematic. Enhanced treatment units opened at Atascadero, Coalinga, Napa, and Patton State hospitals. Physical spaces that finally acknowledged, in their design and their staffing ratios, that some of the people inside them required containment commensurate with their histories. The underlying tension between therapeutic mission and security reality did not resolve, because that tension is structural, embedded in the fundamental contradiction of asking a hospital to do what a prison does, while remaining, officially and operationally, a hospital. The staffing crisis that the legislation could not fix persisted. Hospital police officers at California's state psychiatric facilities earned between 40% and 70% less than officers at neighboring city, county, and state agencies. The consequence was a recruitment problem that no amount of legislative goodwill could resolve. Qualified candidates assessed the salary, compared it to what they could earn elsewhere, and went elsewhere. The officers who did come rarely stayed long. Vacancies accumulated. The officers who remained absorbed excessive overtime. Some posts were simply left empty. A hospital that needed more security than it had ever been designed to provide was simultaneously unable to retain the security personnel it had managed to hire because the state would not pay them what the market required. The problem had been identified. It had been presented to the legislature and to the Department of State Hospitals. It had not been solved. Every October 23rd, employees at Napa State Hospital gather to mark the anniversary of Donna Gross's death. It is an act of mourning, and it is also an argument, a claim that the work is not finished, and that the people who work inside these walls are still owed more than the institution has yet provided. In 2016, Edward Charles Alloway, the man who had killed 7 people and wounded 2 others in a mass shooting at California State University Fullerton in 1976, was transferred to Napa. Survivors protested. The transfer was legal, properly processed, and clinically assessed by the standards the system applies. But to the people who had survived what Alloway had done, it was a sharp illustration of the question that Napa's entire history poses and has never answered honestly. And that question has never been answered honestly, which the transfer of Edward Charles Alloway made certain the public could not pretend otherwise. Napa State Hospital today employs approximately 2,335 people and provides around-the-clock care across 5 distinct treatment programs that now separate civil and forensic commitments more deliberately than at any prior point in its history. Specialized units address the specific needs of sex offenders, geriatric patients, and people in substance recovery. The facility has been accredited, reviewed, restructured, and reformed, but it has not been resolved. The gap between what Napa State Hospital was built to do and what the state has ever been willing to fund it to do has existed since the 1890s, when the population first doubled beyond capacity and the reports went to Sacramento and nothing came back. Several legislative sessions have narrowed it, none has closed it, and the people who gather every October 23rd know the difference between narrowing and closing better than anyone. Chapter 9: What the Castle Became. In 1875, on land purchased from a California rancher along the banks of the Napa River, the state of California built a castle, not a castle in any military or aristocratic sense, a castle in the sense that the word carries when people mean something imposing and beautiful and built to last, something that announces by its mere existence that the people who constructed it believed what they were doing mattered. 4 stories of Gothic brick rising from the valley floor, surrounded by orchards and dairy pastures and vegetable gardens, set in air that its founders genuinely believed was part of the medicine. They were wrong about many things, the people who built it. They were not wrong that the residents inside deserved something built with that kind of intention. The castle is gone. It was torn down after the Second World War, replaced by functional buildings that make no such argument and carry no such conviction. The demolition went unremarked in any way proportionate to what was lost. Not merely a building, but the physical embodiment of the only philosophy Napa State Hospital ever had that was worth the name. On the hospital's grounds, in an unmarked field that most visitors never see, approximately 4,000 people are buried. Most of them have no markers. Most were never claimed. They died at Napa. They are the final measure of what the system produced. Not cures, not recoveries, not lives restored, but 4,000 unnamed dead in a field on land that was once chosen for its beauty. The story of Napa State Hospital is not an unusual American story. It is the story of every institution built on the Kirkbride philosophy, subject to the same population pressures, abandoned by the same funding cycles, converted by the same institutional drift, from healing to management, to containment to crisis. What makes Napa's version specific is the accumulation of named human cost, the artists and performers who ended their days in its wards, the dangerous men it could not contain, the workers it could not protect, the patients it could not honor in death. Donna Gross was not a symbol, she was a person. She chose a career built around caring for people that most of society preferred not to think about. And she spent 14 years doing that work inside one of the most difficult institutions in California. And she was killed because the place she served had been failing to provide the basic conditions that would have kept her alive on an ordinary evening in October. The question her death asks is not whether the people inside deserved better. They did. All of them, the patients and the staff, the civilly committed and the forensic cases, the famous and the forgotten, and the 4,000 in the unmarked field. The question is whether the society that built this place and then underfunded and mismanaged and looked away from it for a century and a half will ever be fully honest about what it chose and what those choices cost. The Napa River still runs past those grounds. The hills still rise behind the campus. The institution still stands, reformed, restructured, still imperfect, still unresolved. The castle is gone. The question it was built to answer remains.